Hello, I'm Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to another in our series of double shot interviews. We'll bring in a minister or a chief executive and talk about the stuff we care about, including all sorts of things, property prices, taxes and taxes. So today we've got the Revenue Minister, Peter Dunne here, and he's of course the leader of the United Future Party. Welcome, Peter,
Thanks,
to interest.co.nz. What's the story with the IRD and looking at issues like student loans, working for families? What's going on there?
Well, putting this in the context of the government being strapped for cash, what we've been focusing on a lot, in addition to areas where direct savings could be made, and that's obviously a budget matter, is areas where better administration of the system we have at the moment will reduce a lot of unnecessary expenditure. So, for instance, we changed a lot of the definitions regarding income for working for families purposes to more tightly target that to appropriate recipients and to get over some of the rip-offs that were commonly known to be occurring. It's no secret that we've been working on a range of measures around student loans, which will be announced as part of the budget package, but again, the same broad principles. The student loan system, which has been around for 20 years now, was never actually set up as a commercial loan, so no securities. Pretty lax conditions, and there are good reasons for that about how student loans were awarded. But the crunch comes at the end of it all when you're trying to track down people who owe money. We've been running, as you know, an initiative in Australia to chase overdue debt, which is showing very good initial returns, already close to $2 million recovered out of that particular campaign. Similarly, I've got announcements coming up mid-year around changes to the child support system.
What could the IRD do there?
In the child support case, well, we administer the scheme. The bulk of the overdue child support payments in New Zealand are penalty payments. Most people are pretty good when it comes to paying the principal, but if you miss, there's quite a punitive penalty regime in terms of interest.
And does it compound with interest?
Yes, it does, and it's something in the order of about 24% per annum. So it's quite high.
How big is the pot of money you could go for?
Oh, it's close to $2 billion. Now, that's not all going to be recoverable. But what tends to happen is a lot of people just get to the point of panic, so they stop paying everything because I can't cope. Now, maybe we need to take a more enlightened approach to some of the penalty payments to spur payment of the initial principal.
So some sort of holiday or
well, I'm
amnesty?
not sure about a holiday, but some sort of, we're looking at some work around how we can better incentivise people to repay early. That's another things flow from that. For instance, the Inland Revenue Department has the power to make attachment orders to people's bank accounts so that payments are actually made on time. But it's never really actually exercised that power. So one of the things I'm keen to do is just to simply make that not a power or an option, but a mandatory requirement.
So this is just for child support or other things as well?
In this instance, it's just for child support. But one of the things we're finding as you look across the system, and again, I can only speak from Inland Revenue's viewpoint, but I know that MSD is doing something similar in its area, that the sorts of steps we've taken with working for families, the sorts of things we're considering for student loans and for child support actually all have a common thread. And the Auditor General, for instance, just this week has reported on the level of government, not so much government debt, but money owed to government that's not being collected. And there's a real concern there. And what both Mr English, Paula Bennett, myself and Stephen Joyce are working on is, are there common threads across the system here where we can better not so much target the resource, but make sure that people who are benefiting from the government's largesse, if you like, are meeting their responsibilities.
So could the IRD therefore use this power to attach orders to bank accounts for more than just for child support?
That's not being contemplated at the moment, but the whole issue of, if you like, Crown debt and how it's made up is very much on the agenda. And for instance, I'll give you one example. At the moment, people get their tax refunds each year. One of the issues that's been raised is, well, should the Crown take first claim on those? For instance, if you've got a tax refund of a few $100s and an overdue tax debt, I'm not talking about just this year's bill that hasn't been paid, but a historical tax debt of maybe a larger sum, we offset your refund against that debt. Now, these issues are still very much early days, but the thinking that's emerging is that in addition to trying to balance the books and curb expenditure, we've got to look at some of the other issues in the budget where more prudent application of the rules would save us quite a lot of wasteful expenditure.
Student allowances?
They're not on the agenda at the moment in terms of eligibility, although there are one or two issues around eligibility for some that will be addressed in the budget context. But more particularly, our focus has been on student loans, and especially overseas debtors, where their rate of repayment is 5 times slower than onshore borrowers. Onshore borrowers tend to repay pretty quickly in about 5 years. Those overseas, and the further overseas they are, the longer the line, it's about 15 years plus. And if you go to the UK and Europe, then real problems in even finding them.
And the potential pot of money that could be clawed
It's quite
back.
substantial. We're talking very large sums, hundreds of millions.
Now, one issue around the strength of the tax base is family trusts. People point at family trusts as a vehicle often used by wealthier New Zealanders to, frankly, avoid paying tax, avoid allowing creditors and the IRD to get access to assets. Do you think family trusts should be banned?
No, I don't. I think there are two separate issues with family trusts. One is, if you like, a broad governance issue about how trusts are structured, how they operate. And the Law Commission is doing work on that at the moment for Simon Power. The second issue is the use of trusts as an avoidance vehicle. And if you look at the figures, there's a very strong correlation between what I think is the worst tax decision made in New Zealand in recent history, the upping of the top personal rate from 33 to 39, and the explosion in family trusts.
Maybe they should have just put the family trust rate up to 39.
Well, you could argue that, but they go hand in hand. Now, one of the reasons why the government last year standardised the two rates was to prevent that avoidance opportunity. It's quite stark when you look at the figures. And I've calculated, the advice I've had is that's costing the revenue around $300 million a year. So for the duration of that period, the 10 years, $3 billion potentially not collected. That has you think about what we could have done with $3 billion more over the last decade. It's therefore of great concern that David Cunliffe is now talking about reinstituting the differential, because all that's going to do is fuel another great explosion.
Is this then why the government has taken the duty of gifting into family trusts?
Well,
the theory being, if you can get in there before an increase in that top tax rate, you've managed to get it all off your books.
The reality with the gift duty, which is our second oldest tax, stamp duty, which we apply at 0% is our oldest, so that's probably next in my sights. The gift duty raises, in a good year, $1.5 million. It costs inland revenue around half of what it raises to administer. 98-point-something% of the returns are nil returns. But our estimate from accountants and lawyers, and their cumulative figures are, it costs them around them and their clients around $70 million a year to comply with a tax that produces $1.5 million.
But isn't there a danger that when you drop it, people dump all their assets into trusts?
No, and I'll come back to that point. So from the point of view of administration, it's a no-brainer. This thing doesn't work. It's long outlived its usefulness. In fact, it was supposed to go at the time that estate duty was abolished, but they never got round to it. What we've discovered as we've gone through the process of looking at alternatives is that within existing social security law, some of the commerce provisions, I think some of the health acts, there are very strong safeguards to prevent the sort of thing that you say. And the big concern about the abolition of gift duty has always been people minimising their asset base to qualify for residential retirement home subsidies. All of these agencies have said to us, we actually have power in our own legislation to deal with that, but we've never bothered to use that power because gift duty's always been there. And so we said, well, if gift duty was to be abolished, do we need to take any further legislative steps to bolster the situation? They all said no. We've got the power. We just have to start utilising those powers. And it seemed to us when we looked at it, well, that was a bit daft to have, over the years, empowered various agencies with authority to actually check against these types of abuses, but had them all say, well, we don't need to do anything here because gift duty's around, and gift duty is so hopelessly inefficient. So we're confident on the basis of the work that we've done that those other provisions will cover for the type of situation that you fear. On top of that, though, is that broader question of the governance arrangements for trusts, which is being resolved in a separate process.
Wouldn't it be just simpler to have a higher top income tax rate and more fiscally sustainable that is the same as the family trust rate?
I don't think so. I think our experience over the last decade, where we did have, certainly by the standards of the last 20 years are reasonably high top personal rate, except historically you could argue, well, we were at 66 at one stage. We've seen so many distortions creep into the system. As I say, the explosion of family trusts, the other one that we've talked about previously on this program is the growth in LAQCs, and a whole plethora of avoidance opportunities, the massive movement in salary sacrifice areas, for instance, where people simply sought to minimise the impact of that top rate. So the government has settled very much for a low rate environment. I think we've got a very competitive tax structure now.
Is that fiscally sustainable though?
Yes,
really?
I think it is. I think that
we're going to borrow $20 billion this year.
Well, yeah, but this year we've got some very extraordinary circumstances, like 2 major earthquakes to have to respond to, for instance.
But we have a structural budget deficit of 5% of GDP.
Well, I think when you wait till the budget figures are announced, the government's going to have quite a good story to tell in terms of the return to a surplus. And part of the reason for that is because, in addition to just the sort of the shaving amounts off, we are addressing, as I said earlier, some of these structural issues about how debt is incurred, how it's repaid, and how the whole process of, if you like, the state's advances to people are managed. So I'm reasonably confident looking forward that the position is sustainable. I think that the key that's needed is obviously a restoration of economic growth and a restoration of employment levels. You know, we're 6-point-something% at the moment unemployed. By our standards, that's very high. By international standards, you know, we're not doing too badly. But I don't think we can afford to be complacent. So I think that's where the focus has got to be, very much into now growing the economy, having rebalanced it, growing it and creating opportunities going forward.
The May budget last year included this massive tax juggle, if you like.
Switch.
Six months on, has it worked to improve growth? Because when you look at the government's accounts, it looks to me like revenues are pretty weak.
I think if you look at the figures overall, our revenues are still weak, but that's the consequence of the global financial crisis. But having said that, they are ahead of where they were forecast to be in the half-year update. And if I look at the track, it's starting to pick up again. So again, taking a longer view, fairly confident about where that direction will head. I think certainly in terms of the movement in the non-income tax areas, the property area, the work on working for families and the broader work around the definition of income, I think the early signs are quite positive. Income tax, obviously a popular move. I think you can look at the GST increase. One of the things about that everyone feared was quite a big inflationary spike. There has been an inflationary spike, but not as great as was expected, because a lot of businesses have simply absorbed the increase. So we're a bit more savvy than we were in 1989 at the time of the last increase. And I think, again, some encouragement can be taken from that reaction.
Now, with your United Future hat on, do you think the sale of large chunks of land to foreign owners is a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, I think you've got to be... One point you've got to make right at the beginning is that the sale of large chunks of land, as you put it, is not the same as the sale of an asset, in the sense that you can't pack the land up and take it with you. So that land always remains here.
You can take the income.
Well, you can take the income, and that was the point I wanted to come to. I'm not opposed to the foreign ownership of land per se. I think particularly with regard to farmland, and this issue arises in respect of the Crayford farms and others of similar ilk, I would like to see, while I'm not opposed to foreign investment and foreign ownership, a substantial proportion of the earnings from that land, I think, should be required to be reinvested back in New Zealand. I don't like the idea of people simply coming in here, taking the profit, shifting that overseas.
Is it fair that the Chinese can buy land here, we can't buy it in China?
Well, that's the argument that gets raised, and I don't think it's necessarily an issue of reciprocity. That's where I think some control about what you can actually take out by way of profit is the safeguard against that occurring. I mean, if you look at New Zealand's history, I mean, good God, the meat trade here was founded on foreign investment way back in the 1880s. So this is not some new invention. It's what's actually contributed to our development and growth over 140 odd years.
But the drain on our national income from interest payments on debt and dividends on foreign ownership means that gross national income per capita has actually fallen since 2003.
And that's why I come back to, if you are going to permit more extensive investment in land operations, I think the parallel has to be some control on the ability to migrate profit out of New Zealand. So in other words, if you are running a farming operation in New Zealand, it would be really good to see the processing from those farms taking place in a New Zealand environment. not being shipped to external.
So would you extend control on reinvestment of profits to other industries, banking, media?
Well, I think the most emotive one at the moment is around farmland. I think banking, to some extent, the horse is already bolted the stable at that stage. Media, I think, is contentious for a different reason. It's not about the level of ownership. It's often about the level of performance and whether we're getting the same news, if you like, from a variety of different sources. But I think the primary one of concern relates to particularly farmland, and that's really what will be in my sights at this stage.
Great. Peter Dunne there, the Revenue Minister, taxman, and also the head of the United Future Party. I'm Hickey. That was another in our series of double shot interviews for interest.co.nz.